On the 7th of August, 1942, at 6:53 in the morning, the first wave of American landing craft hit the beaches of a jungle island most of the men aboard had never heard of a month earlier, Guadalcanal. There was no resistance at the water's edge. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction troops, had fled into the trees. For a few hours, it almost felt easy. It would not stay that way. Within days, the men who had landed that morning would be fighting a kind of war the Imperial Japanese Army had not expected and did not know how to answer. Not soldiers who fought by the manual. Soldiers who fought like they had nothing left to lose the moment they hit the sand. But this story isn't really about Guadalcanal. It isn't about one battle or one beach. This is about a reputation, one that Japanese soldiers carried with them from island to island for 3 straight years, whispered in foxholes, written into diaries, repeated in interrogation rooms by prisoners who rarely talked about anything at all. Of every American unit fighting in the Pacific, one branch became the name Japanese troops feared most, not because of numbers, not because of better weapons, because of what happened to the men who faced them. This is the story of why the United States Marine Corps became the enemy Imperial Japan dreaded above all others, and what 3 years of island fighting did to the men on both sides of that fear. To understand why the Marines earned that reputation, you have to understand what kind of war Japan thought it was going to fight. Japanese military doctrine going into the Second World War was built on a set of assumptions that had worked, more or less, for decades. Speed. Aggression. The idea that a smaller, more disciplined force could break a larger, softer enemy through sheer willingness to die rather than retreat. In 1941, Japanese forces had swept through Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies in a matter of months, overrunning British, American, and Dutch garrisons that had, in many cases, folded faster than anyone expected. There was a belief inside the Japanese high command, not universal, but widespread, that Western soldiers, and American soldiers in particular, were soft, comfortable, unwilling to die for ground the way a Japanese soldier was trained to. That belief did not survive contact with the United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps that landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 was, on paper, not an intimidating force. It was undersupplied. Many of the men were reservists with only months of training. The Navy that was supposed to support them withdrew its carriers within 48 hours of the landing, out of fear of losing them to Japanese air attack, leaving the Marines on the island essentially stranded, with limited food, limited ammunition, and no guarantee of resupply. What made the difference wasn't equipment. It was a doctrine the Marine Corps had spent 2 decades quietly building, almost in isolation from the rest of the American military. A doctrine built entirely around one problem. How do you take a heavily defended island beach and hold it through the 1920s and 1930s? While much of the U.S. Army trained for a war in Europe, Marine officers at Quantico had been developing amphibious assault theory, how to land troops under fire, how to move inland fast before the enemy could organize a counterattack, how to fight in terrain with no clear front line. It was a strange, unglamorous specialty that most of the American military establishment considered a niche concern. In the Pacific, it turned out to be exactly the skill set the war required. At a place called the Tarawa River, on the night of August 21st, 1942, just 2 weeks after the landing, Japan learned the first hard lesson about what this new enemy actually was. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led roughly 900 men in a night assault against the Marine perimeter, confident that a determined bayonet charge would break the American line the way it had broken so many others. It was standard doctrine: concentrate overwhelming aggression at a single point, and the enemy would collapse. The Marines did not collapse. Dug into positions along a sandbar at the river mouth, supported by machine guns and artillery, they held the line through repeated frontal assaults, then counterattacked at dawn. By the time it was over, Ichiki's detachment had been almost completely destroyed. Of roughly 900 men who crossed that sandbar, fewer than 100 survived. Ichiki himself is believed to have taken his own life rather than report the defeat. It was the first time in the Pacific War that a Japanese infantry force had been annihilated in a stand-up fight, and it happened against Marines who had been on the island less than 3 weeks. What followed over the next 6 months on Guadalcanal set a pattern that would repeat, in different forms, on nearly every island that came after. Japanese commanders, trained to believe that spirit and willpower could overcome material disadvantage, kept ordering attacks that assumed the enemy would break under pressure. The Marines kept not breaking. At Edson's Ridge in September, a battalion of Marine raiders outnumbered dug into a ridgeline south of the airfield, held against repeated night assaults from a Japanese force nearly 3 times their size, in fighting so close that men were killing each other with knives and entrenching tools in the dark. The airfield held. It always came back to the airfield, Henderson Field, the single reason the entire campaign existed, and the one piece of ground the Marines were never willing to give up, no matter what it cost. That defeat at the Tarawa did not end Japanese attempts to retake the airfield, it only changed the scale. In September, Japan sent a much larger force under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, roughly 6,000 men, with orders to break the Marine perimeter once and for all. What followed became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, though the men who fought it and the historians who later studied it sometimes called it Bloody Ridge, a narrow, grass-covered spine of high ground just south of Henderson Field that Kawaguchi's forces attacked for 2 consecutive nights. The Marine raiders and parachutists holding the ridge, roughly 800 men under Colonel Merritt Edson, were outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and by the second night, artillery support and reinforcements were the only thing standing between the Japanese assault and the airfield itself. Positions were overrun and retaken multiple times in the dark. At one point, Edson's own command post came under direct attack. The line held barely, and Kawaguchi's force, like Ichiki's before it, was broken in the attempt, losing well over half its strength. What made the following months on Guadalcanal so punishing was not only the fighting, but the conditions the Marines were fighting in. The Navy's withdrawal in the campaign's opening days had left the men ashore desperately short of food, medicine, and ammunition for weeks at a time. While Japanese destroyers, moving so regularly down the channel between the islands that American sailors nicknamed the route the Tokyo Express, ran nightly resupply and reinforcement missions to the Japanese forces on the island, Marines subsisted for stretches on captured Japanese rice. Malaria spread through the ranks faster than combat wounds did, and by the time Army reinforcements began arriving in late 1942 to relieve them, entire Marine units were being pulled off the island simply because there were more men sick than fit to fight. And still, through all of it, the perimeter around Henderson Field did not fall. By the time Guadalcanal was declared secure in February 1943, something had shifted in how Japanese forces talked about their enemy. Captured documents and diaries recovered from Japanese dead, a grim but common source of intelligence throughout the Pacific campaign, began to reflect a specific fear that hadn't been there in the war's opening months. It wasn't panic exactly, it was closer to dread. A recognition that the Marines fighting them did not behave the way the pre-war assumptions said the enemy would behave. They held ground under artillery bombardment that should have broken them. They counterattacked at moments when retreat would have been the rational choice. And when battles turned into close quarters fighting, bayonets, grenades, sometimes bare hands in the dark, Marine units were, again and again, coming out the other side, still holding the position. It's worth pausing on where the fear of Marines specifically, as opposed to American troops in general, actually came from, because the two are not automatically the same thing, and Japanese accounts of the period were often careful to draw that distinction. The nickname Devil Dogs itself predates the Pacific War entirely. It traces back to the First World War, when German troops facing Marines at Belleau Wood in 1918 reportedly used the term Teufelhunden to describe the ferocity of the assault they encountered, and the Marine Corps adopted the name as a badge of honor afterward. By the time the Pacific War began, it was already part of Marine Corps identity, printed on recruiting posters, worked into unit lore. What the island campaigns did was give Japanese soldiers direct, repeated, personal reason to believe the reputation was earned rather than propaganda. And unlike the German troops at Belleau Wood who fought the Marines once in a single, brutal battle and then moved on, Japanese defenders across the Central Pacific kept encountering the same doctrine, the same tactics, and often units carrying the same battle honors, island after island, for 3 straight years. It stopped being a story about one battle and became, in effect, a known quantity. The way a boxer might dread a specific opponent's style, having felt it land before. Part of what made this reputation so specific to the Marine Corps, rather than American forces generally, was how the war in the Pacific was actually fought. The Pacific campaign split broadly into 2 theaters of operation with 2 different commands. General Douglas MacArthur ran the Southwest Pacific push through New Guinea and eventually the Philippines, using primarily Army divisions. Admiral Chester Nimitz ran the Central Pacific campaign, the island-hopping route through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and eventually Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and that campaign was built, structurally, around Marine amphibious divisions, because that was the exact mission the Marine Corps had spent 20 years training for. The result was that Japanese garrisons defending the Central Pacific island chain, the islands closest to the Japanese home islands, the ones defended most fanatically because they mattered most strategically, were the ones facing Marines most often and facing them in the most extreme conditions imaginable, tiny coral atolls with nowhere to retreat, nowhere to maneuver, no path forward except straight into fortified positions, and no path back except into the sea. Tarawa in November 1943 showed the world what that kind of fighting actually looked like. The atoll of Bedio was barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, and the Japanese garrison commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had reportedly told his men that 1 million Americans could not take the island in 100 years. He had reason for the confidence. The beaches were laced with concrete bunkers, log and sand fortifications, and interlocking machine gun positions that had been under construction for over a year. When the 2nd Marine Division hit the beach on the morning of November 20th, the tide was lower than expected, and landing craft grounded hundreds of yards offshore on the coral reef. Marines had to wade in through chest-deep water under direct machine gun fire with nowhere to take cover. It was, by casualty rate, one of the bloodiest 76 hours in American military history. Over 1,000 Marines were killed in 3 days fighting for an island smaller than most city parks. But of the roughly 4,500 Japanese and Korean laborers defending the atoll, fewer than 20 Japanese soldiers were taken alive. The rest fought until they were dead, not because surrender was tactically impossible in every case, but because the Japanese military code of the era, formalized in a 1941 directive known as the Senjin-kun, explicitly forbade surrender as a form of dishonor worse than death. What Tarawa demonstrated to the entire Pacific theater to both sides was that Marine amphibious assault doctrine could break even the most heavily fortified position in the world at a cost, but it could be broken. And it demonstrated to the Japanese high command that no fortification, however total, would make the Marines stop coming. That word started to travel. Captured letters from Japanese soldiers on later islands, Peleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima, increasingly referenced the earlier Central Pacific battles by name almost as folklore passed between units who had never met each other. Men writing home or writing in diaries they knew might never leave the island described the Marines as an enemy that could not be reasoned with through the tools that had worked against every other opponent Japan had faced. Fear of encirclement did not stop them. Fear of casualties did not stop them. The usual psychological pressure points that a defending force relies on, exhaustion, attrition, the hope that the attacker will eventually decide the cost isn't worth it, simply did not apply. One Japanese officer's diary recovered on Peleliu in 1944 described watching Marine assault waves reform and come forward a second time within minutes of being cut down by machine gun fire on their first attempt, and noted with something close to bewilderment that the tactic that had broken every other Allied force it had been used against, heavy, sustained defensive fire from prepared positions, did not appear to change the Marines' calculations at all. One documented account that survived the war belongs to a Marine named Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 1st Marine Division who fought at both Peleliu and Okinawa and later became a biology professor, writing one of the most widely read first-hand memoirs of the Pacific War. Sledge described Peleliu, a tiny, brutally hot coral island that Marine Command had initially expected to take in a matter of days, as a landscape that had been transformed into something closer to a moonscape by the time the fighting was finished, a place where the usual boundaries between the living and the dead broke down under weeks of continuous close combat in extreme heat with almost no natural water source on the island. The operation, planned for 3 or 4 days, took over 2 months. Nearly all of the roughly 11,000 Japanese defenders were killed rather than captured. What Sledge's account makes clear, more than the tactical details, is what that kind of fighting did to the men who survived it on both sides, how the absence of any real possibility of surrender on the Japanese side turned every single position into a fight that could only end one way, and how that reality shaped the way American troops, including Marines, approached every subsequent battle. If the enemy in the next bunker was not going to surrender no matter what, then every bunker had to be cleared the hard way, every single time. By early 1945, when Marine divisions landed on Iwo Jima, the fear had, in a strange sense, calcified into Japanese defensive doctrine itself. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the island's defense, had studied the earlier Central Pacific battles closely and had concluded that the old approach, meeting the Marines at the beach with a strong forward defense and hoping to destroy the landing before it could establish a foothold, did not work against this particular enemy. Beach defenses got overrun. So Kuribayashi did something almost unheard of in the Pacific War. Up to that point, He ordered his men to abandon the beach almost entirely, and instead built an 11-mile network of tunnels, caves, and interlocking bunkers into the volcanic rock of the island itself, designed not to stop the Marines from landing, but to bleed them for every single yard once they were ashore. He explicitly forbade the large-scale suicidal banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles, recognizing correctly that throwing men forward in the open against Marine positions simply gave the enemy easy kills. Instead, his roughly 21,000 men were ordered to fight from concealment to make the Marines dig them out of every hole one at a time. It was, in effect, a defensive doctrine built entirely around the specific reputation the Marine Corps had earned over the previous 2.5 years, an acknowledgement from one of Japan's most capable commanders, that there was no version of open, conventional resistance that was going to stop them. It did not stop them. It took 36 days, cost nearly 7,000 Marine and Navy dead, and became the single bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. But of the roughly 21,000 men Kuribayashi commanded, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest died in the tunnels, in the caves, in the black volcanic sand, following a code that gave them no other acceptable outcome. By April 1945, the final and largest battle of the Pacific War was underway on Okinawa, an island close enough to mainland Japan that its loss would put American bombers and, eventually, an invasion force within direct striking distance of the home islands. Okinawa was not a purely Marine operation. 2 Marine divisions and 4 Army divisions fought there together under overall command of the U.S. 10th Army, making it the largest combined arms land battle of the entire Pacific War. But the pattern that had defined the previous 3 years held here too. Japanese Commander General Mitsuru Ushijima, like Kuribayashi before him at Iwo Jima, chose to abandon aggressive beach defense in favor of deeply entrenched positions in the island's southern hills, built around a network of fortified lines anchored at Shuri Castle, designed to make the Americans pay in blood for every ridge rather than try to stop the landing itself. The fighting dragged on for 82 days through the spring rains in conditions that turned the southern half of the island into flooded, corpse-strewn mud. Eugene Sledge, the same Marine mortarman who had survived Peleliu the year before, fought through Okinawa as well, and later described it as worse than anything that came before it. Not because the tactics were different, but because 3 years of accumulated exhaustion and the growing dread that the war might never actually end had worn down even hardened veterans in a way that fresh troops could not fully understand. Okinawa cost the lives of more than 12,000 American service members and well over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, along with a devastating civilian death toll among Okinawan islanders caught between the two armies. It was also the battle where Japanese resistance, for the first time on a large scale, extended beyond soldiers to civilians who had been told falsely, in many documented cases, that American troops, and Marines specifically, would torture and murder anyone who surrendered. Some civilians took their own lives rather than be captured, a direct, tragic downstream consequence of the same fear that had been built into Japanese military culture for years, now spreading past the army itself and into the population defending its own soil. What all of this built, over 3 years, was something closer to a psychological weapon than a purely tactical one, a reputation that started to do damage before a single shot was fired. Japanese propaganda broadcasts and training materials in the later years of the war increasingly singled Marines out by name, describing them in terms meant to make them seem almost inhuman in their aggression, in an apparent attempt to prepare troops psychologically for what was coming. Whether that framing helped or actually made things worse is hard to say. Some captured accounts suggest it created genuine dread among Green troops who had heard about the earlier island battles secondhand before they had fired a shot themselves. In a war built on the Japanese side around the idea that spirit and resolve could overcome material disadvantage, facing an enemy that appeared to match that resolve and still had better equipment, better logistics, and a doctrine specifically built for exactly this kind of fighting, was its own kind of psychological collapse, playing out island by island for 3 straight years. There is one more layer to this reputation worth understanding, and it comes from the small number of Japanese soldiers who were taken prisoner and interrogated during the campaign. Because the Senjin-kun Code made surrender so culturally forbidden, the men who did end up in American custody, often captured while wounded, unconscious, or physically unable to complete a suicide attempt, represented a strange and unusually candid slice of the Japanese military. Men who had already crossed a line their training told them was unforgivable and who in several documented interrogation reports from the period were noticeably more willing to speak openly than intelligence officers expected. Interrogators working in the Central Pacific Campaign later noted a recurring theme in these conversations: Prisoners consistently distinguished between American units and Marine formations came up again and again as the ones garrison troops were told to fear most specifically, sometimes based on nothing more than word passed between units who had never actually fought them simply because the reputation had outrun the battles themselves. By 1944, some Japanese training materials for troops being sent to defend the Central Pacific Island chain reportedly included specific warnings about marine amphibious tactics, treating the doctrine almost like a weather pattern to be prepared for rather than a conventional enemy to be outmaneuvered. It's a strange kind of achievement, if it can be called that at all, an entire branch of an opposing military, building a reputation so consistent that the enemy's own training pipeline had to account for it by name. None of this meant the war was easy for the Marines, or that the fear only ran in one direction. The casualty rates on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and later Okinawa were staggering by any measure, and the psychological toll on the men who fought those battles has been documented extensively in the decades since what would today be recognized as severe combat trauma, carried home by men who rarely spoke about it for the rest of their lives. The reputation the Marine Corps built in the Pacific was not free. It was paid for, beach by men on both sides of the fighting, most of whom were barely out of their teens by the time Japan surrendered in August 1945. The pattern established at the Tarawa River 3 years earlier had repeated itself in different forms across nearly every major island in the Central Pacific. A doctrine built for a war nobody else had wanted to prepare for had turned out to be exactly the tool needed to break the defensive strategy Japan had built its entire military culture around. Not through superior numbers in most of these battles. Not through easy victories. Marine losses at Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima were among the worst of the entire Pacific campaign. Through simple, repeated, documented refusal to stop coming on islands, where the only alternative available to the men defending them was death. On the 7th of August, 1942, the Marines who waited ashore at Guadalcanal did not know they were about to build one of the most feared reputations of the entire war. Most of them were reservists, many had never been in combat. What they built over the next 3 years, through the Tarawa, through Tarawa, through Peleliu, through Iwo Jima, was not a reputation built on cruelty or numbers. It was built on the one thing Imperial Japan's military doctrine had never accounted for facing: an enemy just as willing to keep coming as they were. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to put stories like this in front of more people, because this isn't just battle history. It's what happens when two militaries built around opposite ideas of resolve collide island by island for 3 years. If you want more, subscribe. We cover the hidden side of history, the campaigns that shape the war but rarely make the textbooks. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.